Welcome to Coruzant Technologies, home of the Digital Executive Podcast. Do you work in emerging tech, working on something innovative, maybe an entrepreneur? Apply to be a guest at www.coruzant.com/brand. Welcome to the Digital Executive. Today's guest is Houman Akhavan. Houman Akhavan is the founder and CEO of G-Check, a hire-to-retire screening platform built on the principle of compliance for good. He brings more than 25 years of experience building and scaling technology businesses across retail, e-commerce, and technology, with a career defined by combining operational discipline with deep regulatory and compliance expertise. Houman is a PBSA FCR Advanced certified and serves on boards of two NASDAQ-traded companies, Outdoor Holding Company and CDON, where he contributes to audit, compensation, and corporate governance. Earlier in his career, he served as Chief Marketing Officer at CarParts.com, where he directed $50 million in annual budgets and helped lead the company through a significant period of digital transformation and growth. He was also part of the founding executive team that took CarParts.com public on NASDAQ and raised over $100 million, returning years later as CMO to lead its digital reinvention. He served on Google's Retail Advisory Council and founded Growth Rocket, a digital marketing agency, before turning his focus to background screening. Well, good afternoon, Houman. Welcome to the show.
Awesome, Brian. Thank you for having me. Really been looking forward to this discussion.
Absolutely, my friend. I do too. I know you're hailing in the LA, Los Angeles area. I'm in Kansas City, so sometimes traversing calendars and time zones is a challenge, but I appreciate you going through that challenge to get here today. Thank you. And Houman, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump into your first question. Let's start with your journey. You spent 25 plus years scaling technology businesses, including a high-profile run as a chief marketing officer at CarParts.com. What drew you from retail and e-commerce into the role of background screening?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brian. On the surface, auto parts and background screening look very different. But what drew me to both was the same pattern. Both were sleepy legacy industry that needed to be built around trust. And that was very much what car parts was. I mean, I've been with that prior to making the transition to the background screening industry over 2 decades within that vertical. There was just so much legacy business required a digital transformation. People operated within that industry with a very old and outdated way of looking at the business and different things. So it was very much, what excited me about that business was the digital transformation that we took place there. But also car parts, the whole business really came down to one thing. Could the customer trust us enough to put a part on their car going 70 miles an hour? So it was very much about trust. And at G-Check, the stakes are different, but they're bigger. Think about who actually gets hired through a background screening system. If you think about the home healthcare aide for your aging parent, or a volunteer coach managing your kids' after school game, or even the nurse on the night shift at your local hospital. These are all people that, go through a background screening process, but they're very essential, to safety and all these various verticals that they touch. Further to that, every screening decision touches a real person on the other side, somebody's kid, somebody's parent, somebody's patient, and the gaps are real. According to the Aspen Institute, only 66% of parents could confirm their child's youth sports coach passed a criminal background check. 24% said they had no idea. I mean, this is just mind-boggling. It's not just a compliance gap, it's a community safety gap. It shows up everywhere: youth programs, healthcare, education, even industries that are supported through transportation. And this is really why I'm so passionate about what we're building. We're modernizing a legacy industry by making trust the product, not only for the employer, for the candidate, and for the people on the other side of every hiring decision. Trust is becoming the most valuable currency in hiring, and that's what's driving us at G-Check.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that. And when I first looked at your profile and your bio, I was like, car parts, how does this translate to background screening? And I love it. You pull that all together. And obviously the number one thing you talked about it is obviously having trust and safety. And of course you wanted to leave the world in a better place and really transforming this legacy industry. And you shared some statistics about screening and background and parents not knowing who their children are exposed to as far as criminal background checks. Sometimes they're just not as thorough, they're not accurate. And I have just really appreciate you building that trust within this industry. Houman, G-Check is built on the principle of compliance for good. Where did that conviction come from? And what did you see in the screening industry that convinced you it was overdue for change?
Yeah, absolutely. As I came out of the car parts industry, being in that industry for over 2 decades, and I reflected on my experiences there, yes, I had all the successes, all the accomplishments, and all that's great. And it's obviously what drives us. I mean, at the end of the day, we want to be successful in any craft that we're in. But I felt like something was missing. And I always looked at companies that had a purpose-driven mission, right? They could obviously run a profitable business. That's very important too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not downplaying that. You want to run a business that could be sustainable, but if you can align it with a purpose-driven mission, then what better way that you can do some good in the world? And it's just something that I always personally been drawn to. If I could look back on my legacy one day and say, hey, I did something that had an impact on people's lives. And I just didn't feel that in the car parts industry. It was great. And it's where I built my career and a lot of my success. So compliance for good was the opportunity to build that. And what I came to believe is that compliance done right is one of the most underrated forces for good in business. And that's what we came up with compliance for good. It's built on 3 pillars: transparency, fairness, and protected compliance. And it's dynamic and it applies in so many different ways because it could, and that was really important to us. How could this mission be applied to across industries, right? We don't want to come up with something that, hey, it's only limited to one particular industry. So it was very important for us to have a driving mission and philosophy that we can affect and have an impact on so many different industries. So it's further that it protects vulnerable populations. And we just touched on this, whether it's kids in youth programs, patients in healthcare, the elderly in home care. It's really the people who depend on the integrity of who's been hired to care for them. And in the process, it also protects brands and organizations. Obviously, one very obvious example is one bad hire can result in a negligent hiring lawsuit, a story in the news, or a sex offender slipping through onto a volunteer roster can actually undo years of brand equity overnight. Compliance done right protects the people that you're trying to serve and the organization serving them. And again, the same way that I talked about how there was a legacy issue within the auto parts vertical, there's also legacy, providers that are within the background screening vertical, where they just treat compliance as a cost center. It's something that you just do so you don't get sued, and they see it as the goal to just check a box and move on. And that framing fails on both sides. Candidates can get black box rejections with no recourse, or employers can get stuck with a consumer report that they can't defend if a decision is challenged by a consumer. And where we see the bigger shift happening is compliance is becoming the category. The differentiator in screening is moving away from speed and price. And you see this in a lot of verticals. Everything's about speed and it's a race to the bottom from a price perspective. But what we believe, we need to be moving towards auditability, transparency, and trust. And that's the lane we're building. And just to close on that thought, compliance should build trust, not friction. That is truly what compliance for good is all about.
That's awesome. Thank you. And you really unpack that part around trust and how that relates in that whole compliance piece. You talked about it. You're always driven over your career. And when you founded G-Check, you talked about that importance of a mission-driven purpose. And the big thing I took away here, that compliance for good was built on 3 pillars: transparency, fairness, and protective compliance. And again, I appreciate you sharing that. I think there's a lot behind that, and I'm glad we're getting your message out today. Houman, you recently partnered with Cerebrum to defend against deepfakes and synthetic identities in hiring. How serious is the fraud threat right now? And why does identity verification have to start at the very front of the screening workflow?
Yeah, this is obviously, it's a very serious issue. It's one that we're taking with a lot of attention and focus. I mean, the news headlines have been there, and this isn't a future problem. It's already affecting organizations today. And the projections I've seen are alarming. According to Gartner research, they're predicting by 2028, 1 in 4 candidate profiles globally will be fake. And to add to that, Deloitte predicts AI-enabled fraud losses in the US will hit 40 billion by 2027, up from 12 billion just a few years ago. And what we're seeing operationally, in G-Check today is we're seeing synthetic identities, we're seeing AI-generated work samples, voice clone references, and deepfake video interviews, just among a few of the things that we're seeing right now that we're trying to combat against. And it's actually gotten so bad that federal agencies are warning employers about this. Recently, the FBI and DOJ have been issuing advisories. And one, I'll share a couple startling ones. There are nationwide cases of North Korean operatives getting hired into US tech companies using stolen American identities. Further, to add to that, an Arizona woman was just recently sentenced to 8 years in prison for running what they called a laptop farm for these workers. So basically, people in the US had set up laptop farms. So for people from countries such as North Korea could use deepfakes and apply for jobs, and they were getting hired into US tech companies. Imagine what a breakdown of security and intrusion is taking place. And further to add to that, in our own research, workers are telling us what's driving this behavior. As you may be aware, we recently surveyed 1,500 workers for our automation anxiety report that was just recently released earlier this month. 63% admitted to exaggerating their AI skills, and among Gen Z, it was as high as 80%. But the most surprising stat was that 48% told us that weak employer verification is what made it possible. Essentially, workers are literally telling employers their verification gap is what's driving the behavior. I use the analogy of like, if you leave your back door open to your house and somebody walks by, well, they're going to take advantage of that opportunity. And what we feel, and we talked about transparency, if the other side understands that, hey, there are systems in place and these are the things that we're going to be verifying, then they wouldn't be embellishing and exaggerating skills that they knew were going to be tested, right? So even workers are saying, hey, well, if we knew the verification would be stronger, then maybe we wouldn't go to these extremes. And that's essentially why we built our partnership with Cerebrum. It's what we call verified entry. Identity gets confirmed with biometric liveness detection before any background check begins. Here's the thing, hiring used to be about whether the candidate was qualified. Today, it's also about whether the candidate is really who they say they are. And that continues every downstream check, whether it's a criminal record, sex offender registry, a nursing license, or employment verification, it's anchored to the identity at the top of the order. So if that identity is wrong, you're verifying the wrong person. So essentially, if that identity, it has to be the first step in the process. Many years ago, people weren't even thinking about identity because so many hiring was done in person. But obviously, we're now in this post-COVID era. You have remote workforces that continue to be employed, and I don't necessarily see that changing anytime soon. We have to change the background screening industry, and I really believe that verified entry has to start at the beginning of the process. And one final point on identity, a nurse was arrested in Pennsylvania last summer with 20 aliases and 7 social security numbers. Running background checks on the wrong identity makes everything below it meaningless. Identity has to be at the top, or none of it means anything. And I truly believe this is the direction that the industry is heading.
Wow, amazing. You shared a lot of statistics there for sure. Some of the stuff we sort of knew about, but the fact that you add some numbers behind this and the fact people are running laptop farms and nurses with multiple social security numbers is crazy. But at the end of the day, it is overwhelming and we've got to get it right. And you talked about that identity being first, foundationally, right? Verification with biometric qualification before any background check starts. That's a big highlight that I took away. Obviously, security is paramount here. So thank you. And Houman, last question of the day, as we look ahead to the future, how do you see AI reshaping background screening and hiring over the next few years? And what should employers be doing now to build trust into that process?
Yeah, let me start with the upside because it's real. AI is making screening genuinely better. It's faster, more accurate. It's better at things like sorting out common names and alias matching. I'll use my name as an example, Houman Akhavan. I think in the world, there's probably 3 or 4 that have that name combination. But if you have a name like John Smith, there's like over 40,000 John Smith in North America alone. So it's for things like that, leveraging biometric liveness detection and other forms of AI, it can really help. It's going to do it way better than a human can to just really identify accuracy and mismatches. And the efficiency gains are real. And we see it every day in G-Check's operations. But the bigger shift is that screening is moving away from a one-time event at hire to a continuous trust and risk function. So in the past, you would have always thought about background check. It's done at the point of hire, but it's no longer the case. Now you have continuous monitoring, you have continuous background checks. And this matters a lot in industries such as healthcare, where a nurse can lose their license tomorrow or show up on an exclusion list. If they're employed in a healthcare environment, you can't only check that information at the time of hire. It's essential to know that throughout the tenure of their employment in the industry that they're in. There's patients in their care that need someone watching for that change. Or I'll use another industry, a commercial truck driver. Think about a huge, large semi that are on the roads. I mean, these are large vehicles that if they don't have the right qualified drivers, and if, let's say, a concerning red flag shows up on their motor vehicle record, well, that's not something that you could check at the time of the hire. And there's obviously the transportation industry is highly regulated and there's standards and rules of when those things need to be checked. But that's another example of continuous monitoring is something that's also continuous changing. And to add to that, the workforce is dynamic and verification has to be too. I'll use one more example. Social media screening is another one where in the past, social media screening wasn't necessarily something that's prevalent. But now in this day and age, people are posting things on social media. And that's something that, obviously with the proper consents and all that, it's something that could be leveraged in a background check process as well. So if I can highlight 3 areas of what employers should be doing right now, we touched on it earlier. First, verify identity at the point of the job application, not at the offer stage. Second, keep humans in the loop on adverse decisions. And according to our research, 61% of workers want human review when AI is involved. This is table stakes for how you defend an adverse action under the Federal Credit Reporting Act. So it's not only that you were doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. The FCRA, it's basically the federal guidelines that oversee what consumer reporting agency, essentially background check companies can do. And you need a human in the loop. So while you use AI as a tool and it's great for efficiency, automation and all of that, and use it in that regard, but you still need a human in the loop for when things go wrong and to be in compliance with the Federal Credit Reporting Act. So you absolutely need to have a human in the loop. When we talk about AI, it's not about 100% automation, right? You still need a human in the loop too. And that's how you preserve trust with the candidate. And third is to treat compliance as a system, not a checkbox. The states are diverging fast. Laws, whether it's California, Colorado, New York, or Illinois, each of them are going their own separate ways. So it's important that you treat compliance as a holistic approach. And that's what we see that the mode is, right? It's not just a checkbox. And I believe that the companies that are going to win are using AI aggressively, but they're keeping humans in the loop on the decisions that matter most. And just to close on this point, responsible AI is going to be a real competitive advantage. And you really, again, not to belabor the point, but you need humans in the loop. And I believe we are best positioned to win here.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, Houman. A couple things I highlighted here. Obviously, AI is going to make it way better. The screening process will be faster, more accurate, more efficiencies along the way. But what I really took away from this is this screening event you talked about. Generally, that happens at the beginning and it's a one-time deal. But now it's moving from that point of hire to continually monitoring, especially in those sensitive, regulated or high-risk environments. I thought that was interesting. And the workforce is dynamic. So should the screening and verification process. And the last thing I'll say is you talked about employers should be looking for 3 things. And I took a note here: verify identity at application, keep humans in the loop for everything, but especially those adverse decisions, and then treat compliance as a system, not a checkbox. And I think those are the big takeaways from your answers today. And I really appreciate it. And Houman, it was such a pleasure having you on today. And I look forward to speaking with you real soon.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me. And I hope your audience found value in this and looking forward to doing this again in the future. Appreciate it.
Bye for now.